everybody? Richard Dolan here for a courageous conversation.
Well, man, today, you're right. There's no going back.
How do you feel the weight of that desire?
I have been there for a while.
Story's still being written, and you cut the story short. As they say, I'm playing with house money.
They said, neo-fascist.
You can't imagine, Richard. I've heard everything now.
But I'll tell you what, you ain't never buying your time back. Value your time.
Once you start a courageous conversation, there ain't ever going back to an ordinary one.
How would you best describe where the inspiration for Gumball 3000 came from?
So, whilst I did grow up watching Cannibal Run and those other kind of road movies of the 70s, and there's definitely some inspiration by that, I think what happened for me was slightly more organic than really kind of seeing those and trying to replicate them. Essentially, I spent the 1990s kind of combining, again, all the things I'm into. So let's say by the end of my teenage years, I was a fairly all right proficient skateboarder. And that action sports world was kind of making my life tick, and I was sponsored and so on, and it was taking me around the world, and hence a lot of friendships with people like Tony Hawk and people in that kind of world really have stemmed from many, many years ago. I then, like a lot of other kind of late teenagers, don't really know what you want to do. I think apart from just skateboarding, sport was my whole life. That was what I was into. I think I was also into the culture of sport at a very young age without realizing it, and into the fashion of it, whether that's football kits or skate culture, street culture. I was pretty kind of always, had a passion for that and interest in it. So when I was 18, I went to a college in London called St. Martin's, which is a very famous fashion school. And again, I went there because sport and art were what made me tick. I never wanted to design women's wear or whatever, which a lot of people go there for. It was always kind of a sports related kind of interest for me. But it was, if you're in the arts world or the fashion world, you'll know of it. My tutor there was John Galliano. I was in the same class and year as Alexander McQueen and Stella McCartney and Giles Deacon, all these people that have kind of been running the fashion industry for the last sort of 20, 30 years. By pure chance, we were there at the same time in the same class. And so I had this kind of fashion world sort of suddenly, imposed on me. I was in it, I was designing, living in London now at this point, part of that London fashion scene. I'm giving you this background story because it's really how Gumball came about, that I then got very lucky, and again, going back, I'm 47 now, so going back to late teenage years, a little bit younger, a bit more hair. I got asked to model for a few different brands.
According to my notes, Speedo was one of them. Is this a rumor?
That's a rumor. No, I was very lucky. I looked very much the kind of stereotypical English kind of look that was probably popular at the time for a few fashion companies, including Giorgio Armani and Ralph Lauren. And I ended up being in their adverts for about 5 years in a row, doing their runway shows along with many other brands. But it gave me some great money at a very early age. And what did I do with that money? I didn't spend it wisely. I spent it on the one sporting pursuit that I'd never had the opportunity to do as a kid, and that was to race cars. I literally got my checks from these brands, and I would spend it all at a race circuit in England called Silverstone or Donington, and I would practice at every available weekend. And I started at the bottom of the ladder in what's called Formula Ford and worked my way up. And so over probably a 6-year period of the 1990s, I was studying fashion, modeling, and racing cars for Porsche and then McLaren, all at the same time. And so basically also getting friendships in those worlds. And obviously, like I mentioned, some of the people were becoming famous or successful in their industries already at this time in the fashion world. The likes of Tony Hawk and that were becoming more famous in their world. And then just being in that circle of sort of racing cars, obviously got to know a lot of different drivers that went on to become very successful later on. But I was also coming in contact with some very wealthy people around the world, very successful people, whether they were the fashion brand owners, whether they were the influencers at the time in those sort of worlds as photographers or magazine editors, and also the wealthy guys that were the team sponsors or team owners in my own racing. And so essentially by the end of the 90s, my little black book at the time, my whatever we had, Filofax maybe back then, if people remember Filofax. I don't think I ever had
your Palm
Filofax.
Pilot.
Palm Pilot, my address book by the end of the 90s was a bit of a who's who from around the world, really. And I wanted to create something that could bring all of those people together, because they didn't all mix together. You know, my skateboarding friends and my wealthy race car owner friends didn't know each other, but I kind of felt like I could create something they both enjoyed. And so, bit of a kind of a route to this, I actually tried to buy a Formula One team. And I don't know if any of you follow Formula One or are fans of it, but you know, it was my dream back then to drive in Formula One. I wasn't quite good enough, so what's the next best thing? You try and own a team. And I wanted to own a team to kind of have an impact in it, to bring this kind of music and fashion and sort of action sports culture to a slightly corporate car racing world, as I felt back then. You know, one day I'm going to events and parties with BMW, Mercedes and McLaren, which were great events and cost those companies a lot of money to host and were very corporate and well done. And maybe the next night I was going to a fashion industry party that had very little money, but was really rock and roll, and I enjoyed it a lot more. And so I just wanted to kind of blur those industries. And so I tried to buy this Formula One team, not with my own money. I hadn't made that much money at that point, but it was with the investment of the team owner of the McLaren team I was driving for at that point. And unfortunately, we got outbid by British American Tobacco, by lucky strike. They ended up buying this team called Tyrrell. And so I found myself at the end of sort of 1998, having got all these friends together, essentially told them about my vision to create a Formula One team that was going to be sexier and more rock and roll than anything that existed. I'd got all my wealthy friends together to help support the bankroll it, and suddenly we got nowhere to go with it. So what do? That's how the rally idea came about. I thought, if I can kind of give all these friends of mine an experience, bring them together, instead of just for one night or a party or a conference or whatever you want to call it. I didn't want it to be like that. I wanted this to just be a fun time, not talk about creating any business out of it, just show these friends that I could organize something. And anyway, long story short, that was April 1999. 50 odd friends that I'd invited to kind of join me on this road trip around Europe sort of said, yeah, they're in. And I organized the most amazing sort of 6 days that I could think of, staying in chateaus, having musician friends perform at different parties. And, you know, back then there was no social media. It was just the 110 people or whatever it was, 2 people in a car that enjoyed this road trip. And there were probably sort of 20 famous people in that group of people. And by September that year, Gumball got a feature about that rally, that first one. Photos and an editorial came out, and we got covers of GQ, Esquire, Maxim, and FHM magazine. And that was in the September, October of that year. And you can imagine, that would be pretty powerful still now, even though they're less impactful. But back then, that was as big as it got in media terms. And it was all, of course, it was following the stories and the anecdotes and the photos that were led by some of the big celebrities that were driving in it. But it got me awareness. It was my platform to build on. And that's what happened, you know. So what Gumball is, it's a 6-7 day road trip that brings together the most eclectic group of people from around the world. A lot of them influential in their industries, but strategically across music, film, sport, fashion, business, and other. A few sheikhs in there, a few princes, a few oligarchs, and so on. Many sports stars, and it's a melting pot for kind of an adventure. And so we created this unique adventure that people wanted to be part of. And as the media world sort of, you know, went online, fans started to hear about it, and it just sort of grew from there, really.